Shabbat Shalom. So, later on in my Drasha, I'm going to talk about Rabbi Isaac Herzog. And I thought I'd actually explain a little bit about him now rather than taking, one of my typical detours during the sermons. And if the name Isaac Herzog sounds familiar, well, if it doesn't sound familiar, that's bad, right? Because the current president of the state of Israel is named Isaac Herzog. And the reason that he is named Isaac Herzog is because he is the grandson of Rabbi Isaac Herzog. Rabbi Isaac Herzog, or more probably Yitzhak Halevi Herzog, was the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel. Okay, and he was an interesting guy. I don't really know as much about him as I should, but he was an interesting guy. I mean, if you look at a picture of him, you would probably be surprised to find out that he had a PhD from the University of London. Okay, and actually, you can find online a PDF of his PhD thesis, and I have to say that in the Israel of today, a chief rabbi who had a PhD, there would be no such thing, right? I mean, it's a whole different ballgame. But he was born somewhere in Eastern Europe, but his family immigrated to Leeds in the UK when he was 10 years old. Okay, and so, he was fluent in English. He got his PhD at the University of London. He became the chief rabbi of Ireland, which is about equivalent to being the chief rabbi of Montgomery Village. But, nevertheless, he was the chief rabbi of Ireland, and he was a supporter of the IRA. And then he moved to Israel in the mid-30s, and when Chief Rabbi Abraham Yitzhak Kook passed away, he became the next chief rabbi. But he was the chief rabbi of Ireland, and his son, Chaim Herzog, who also was the president of Israel, and before that was the Israeli, a lot of cabinet folks, but also the Israeli ambassador to the UN. He was actually the ambassador to the UN when they passed that infamous Zionism is racism resolution, and that's why if you listen to the current president Herzog, he speaks almost unaccented American English because he went to high school in New York when his father was the UN ambassador, and he is also the only president of Israel to have been a staffer at Camp Ramah. So he has connections to us, but his father, Chaim Herzog, if you listen to him speak English, he had an Irish accent because he grew up in Ireland. And my mentor, my Rebbe, Father James Wall, some of you may recall him from my installation, he told me the story. So Georgetown University gave an honorary degree to Chaim Herzog when he was the president of Israel. And at the ceremony, they asked my mentor to give the benediction. And the reason that they asked him to give the benediction was that he was the only Jesuit on the faculty of Georgetown who was fluent in Hebrew, right? So Herzog, grows up in Ireland, he knows Israel, so this priest comes up to give the benediction and he bows his head, and my mentor starts giving the benediction in Hebrew, and he said, and he saw Herzog, like he was astonished to find it, a Catholic priest giving the benediction in Hebrew. So when I mention Rabbi Herzog, you know who I'm talking about. Okay, so, as I said, I was kind of surprised in a way that after I finished reading the last Aliyah, right, nobody shouted it out, Adonai Elohechem, because that, we chant that, we read that every service in the morning and every service in the evening, and we usually chant it out loud in the morning, and that is the paragraph about the mitzvah of tzitzit, right? And it tells us that the purpose of the tzitzit is to remember the mitzvot, right? Uschartem et kol mitzvotai v'asitem otam, v'lo taturu acharei levavchem, that you will remember all my mitzvot and observe them and not go astray after your own heart, right? So, I mentioned Rahav in the Haftarah being a zonah, which Rashi explains, mocheret mizunah. Zonah means like a prostitute, okay? But she was the hero of the story, right? So they don't want to say that she was, so that's why they say mocheret mizonot, that she was an innkeeper or a grocer. But there's no reason to doubt that she was actually a prostitute. And anyway, there's a story in the Talmud of a young yeshiva student who saved his money for a long time and went to visit the most expensive and most gorgeous prostitute in the world, and he's getting undressed, and as he's getting undressed, the tzitzit hit him in the face, and he says, I shouldn't be doing this, right? And he gets dressed and he leaves even though he's paid, right? And she is like, what the heck is going on here? So she follows him and he explains why he left. And she was so impressed that she converted to Judaism and she married the young rabbi. Okay, so it had a happy ending. Right, but they're not new, right? Kehilat Shalom, you're supposed to have a thread of blue, right? Most of you do not have a thread of blue. On most occasions, I do not have a thread of blue, but this morning, since that's what I was talking about, I am wearing my talit where the tzitzit do have a thread of blue. Okay, I don't wear it anymore because it kind of wore out, and when I got a new talit, I did not get one with the thread of blue, right? But the late Professor Jacob Milgram, who I've mentioned before, his son Jeremy is a good friend of mine. And he was considered the world's greatest expert in the book of Numbers. And he explains what is this business with the tzitzit? And he explained that in the ancient world, there was a lot of attention paid to the hem of the garment, and the more elaborate the hem of your garment, the more noble you were considered to be, right? And there's a story in the New Testament where a leper reaches out and touches the hem of Jesus' garment and he's healed, right? He touched the tzitzit that Jesus was wearing, right? And the color of the techelet, if you look at it, I mean, I know it's kind of hard to see, right? But this is like a sky blue, right? Or, you're a college basketball fan, it's Carolina blue. It's the same color that the Tar Heels uniforms are, right? Which Carolina fans say it proves God is a North Carolina fan because he made the sky the same color as their uniforms, right? But this is known also as royal blue, right? And if you're making the dye and you leave it out in the sun a little bit longer, it becomes a shade of purple, right? And those two colors are often mentioned together in the Torah, Techelet v'argaman, right? Techelet v'argaman, it becomes a shade of purple. So if you hear somebody referred to as a blue blood, right? Or they were born to the purple, right? It's the same dye. It's just left out a little bit longer. And so this Techelet also is the color of nobility. So by wearing it, we are reminded that as Bnei Israel, as descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, we are all nobility, right? But it was also very expensive, right? Because it's labor intensive. The authentic, like it's not just any blue dye, it's a specific recipe, right? And it tremendously intensive, labor intensive. It was produced from the blood of a certain snail, and the snails are plentiful, actually, or were in the ancient world, but each snail gives only a tiny little amount of dye, right? And then along comes the Roman Empire, and they say production of this dye is now a royal monopoly. Right? If you want this dye, you buy it from a factory owned by the emperor, and anybody who makes this dye like illicitly, death, right? So it became like super expensive. So the rabbi said, you don't have to bankrupt yourself for Techelet. We are letting the mitzvah lapse until such time as Techelet becomes like more interesting, more affordable, right? More affordable, right? So the exact recipe was lost because there were no Jews making it, right? And then in the late 1800s, for some reason, there was like an explosion of interest. Well, maybe we can recapture the recipe for Techelet. And the first person to try to do that was the Radziner Rebbe. And he decided, because we know, in other words, we know from the Talmud that it's made from the blood of a chilazon. Okay, we don't know precisely, or we didn't know what species is a chilazon. So the Radziner Rebbe believed that it was a cuttlefish, and he developed a recipe to make blue dye from a cuttlefish. But there's iron in the recipe, and it produces a dark blue dye. But the lab tests show that the blue it's not from the blood of the cuttlefish, it's from the iron, okay? And you may have seen, actually, I mean, there is or was, I don't know if she's still with us, a fabric artist named Shirley Waxman, and people had, and even in this kind of scene, people had talit that she made, and she often had a blue thread in the tzitzit, but it was a dark blue thread, not this color. So that's the Radziner Techelet, okay, which, sorry to say, is not Techelet at all, right? And you're probably really better off not having a blue thread than having that blue thread. So, but of course, there are still obviously people walking around who wear that shade of Techelet, but it kicked off an interest in the subject, and now here comes Rabbi Herzog, and he, as I said, he wrote his PhD on this subject, and he even coined a new word, porphyrology. Okay, porphyrology is the science of studying blue and purple dyes. Okay, and the Kehilat that I'm wearing is from his research, but how is it confirmed? Okay, and this to me is the part that's most fascinating, right? So in 1982 is the first Lebanon war, right? I mean, I remember that really well. I was in northern Israel at the time the war broke out, okay? And the Israelis captured a lot of southern Lebanon, including the city of Tyre, okay, in Hebrew known as Sur, okay? And it was known that Tyre was a center of production of this dye in the ancient world. Okay, well, wherever the army goes, the archaeologists follow, right? And they discovered that the harbor of Tyre is actually landfill, and the source of the landfill is millions or billions of snail shells. So and it's the same snails that Rabbi Herzog said. Okay, so there is an amuta, a nonprofit in Israel that makes this techelet according to Rabbi Herzog's recipe, and particularly in Israel, you see a lot of people with techelet. It's still expensive, but it's not astronomical. I mean, I guess it depends on your definition of astronomical, but if I were to like want to replace the tzitzit on my other talit with techelet, it's about $80 for a set of 4 tzitzit with the techelet string. So like rabbis are reluctant to say, this is a chovah. You're obligated to wear it, because $80, if it came down to, I don't know, $20 or $30, which it might at some point, then, we might start saying, yeah, you really like have to do it, right? But to get back to Professor Milgram, the tzitzit were shatnez, okay? Like you had a linen garment and woolen tzitzit. And the Torah tells you not to have a garment that is both linen and wool, but unless like there's a specific recipe for that garment in the Torah, and the garment of the high priest was linen and wool, right? So by us wearing a garment specifically for like religious purposes that is linen and wool, it reminds us that we all have this obligation, right? As Rabbi Goldman, our friend who joins us frequently from Canada, pointed out, right? We are told to be Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, right? A kingdom of priests and a holy people. And so the tzitzit like concretize that, okay? That and this to me is the bottom line, and anything that promotes that is a good thing, right? I mean, people said, right, well, Jewish survival is important. Why? Right? Why is it important that there should be Jews in the world? right? And the answer is because we are called to be a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy people. We have mitzvot, right? And our lives should be lives that people look at and they say, these guys have got it right? When I talk about, how many times in the Parsha this week, it says the same law for the citizen and the stranger. I'm not trying to score a political point. I'm really not, okay? It's not about partisanship. It's about what kind of society we're supposed to be, right? And what kind of influence on society we should have, right? And, Jewish politicians have an obligation to try to create a society that says the same law for citizens or strangers, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is not, and I sincerely believe this. I mean, you can strive to create that society as a Democrat. You can strive to create that society as a Republican. You can strive to create that society as an independent. If our disagreements are about how do we create the society, right? Question should not be, is it important to alleviate poverty? Of course it's important to alleviate poverty. People have different ideas on how to do that. And that's great, and that's fine. I mean, if you look at, Jack Kemp or John McCain or Mitt Romney, right? They all agreed. Mix it, right? Our goal should be to eliminate poverty, right? And the best way to do it is this, that, or the other, right? But now we have a fundamental disagreement about whether there should be poverty or not, et cetera, right? Instead of a war on poverty, we have a war on poor people, right? But the Torah, as I said, it tells us what kind of society to create. It doesn't tell us how to create it, right? But the tzitzit and everything, all of the mitzvot are supposed to remind us of our calling to be holy people, so that the world will look at us and say, these people have got it right. Not that I need to become one of them, right? But I need to live by the same ideals that they do. Shabbat Shalom.
Yasher Koach, thank you.